Good afternoon. It's great to be in Africa. It's great to be in South Africa. This is only the second time I've been here, and I love it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making SU South Africa such a success. I'm going to tell you a bit about what we do to bring the world's #1 health problem under control. I'm delighted that Tiffany gave such an excellent introduction to a lot of the technical side of what I want to say. And I'm hoping to put it in the context of our work. And as you'll see, I'm going to also put it in an African context to some extent. You'll see what I mean as I go on. I'm going to start with this. Now, this is not, here we go. This is not a graph of African data. This is from the USA. And it shows the trajectory of longevity. Specifically, this shows the proportion of the US population that are over the age of 65. But, of course, there are many other ways to show this kind of thing. The reason why this graph looks like this is, of course, obvious. It is simply that over the past 150 years, which is before this graph begins, there has been a huge success in the attempt to bring infections under control. Infections used to kill more than 1/3 of babies in the USA and in every country in the world before the age of 1. And of course, they used to kill people in childbirth and throughout life. And that's pretty much gone away throughout the developed world. But of course, you may be immediately thinking, well, the corresponding graph in South Africa or in any African country wouldn't really look like this. And you're right, it wouldn't, because of course there is still a huge amount of mortality in Africa from the most common infections, especially malaria and HIV. And I want to talk about how that is going to shift, how that's going to change in the coming decades. Now, of course, it's already shifting. In fact, it's already shifting quite impressively. The most recent data from the World Health Organization on life expectancy in each country in the world shows that there isn't a single country in the world, even in sub-Saharan Africa, in which life expectancy is lower than 50. Not anymore. The 2015 figures, I think, were the first time when that became true. So that means that even today, aging has become pretty much the most significant, the most prevalent health problem in every country in the world, including South Africa. It's no longer HIV, it's no longer malaria, it's certainly no longer tuberculosis or the other infections that have historically been so prevalent. Now, there's a downside to all of this, which is economics. This again is US statistics, but again, as I shall be explaining, this is the near-term future of South Africa as well. In the past 50 years or thereabouts, which is what this graph is showing, the US economy has grown very rapidly. That's the red line that you can see on this graph. The amount that the US economy spends on medical care has also grown rather sharply. That's the blue line that you can see. But if you look at it like that, you will see that the blue line, well, it's still well below the red line, not a problem, you might think. That's not true when you divide one by the other, and you get the green line, which is the proportion of the US economy that goes to medical care. In just 50 years, it went up from 5% to 18%. That's a crazy increase. And of course, the result in terms of the impact on healthcare costs and in terms of pensions and so on is just enormous. So this is something that anyone who is thinking about the future of Africa should be looking at very hard indeed. Now, for the bulk of what I'm going to say going forward, I want to be a little bit more technical. I want to talk about the nuts and bolts of this problem and its potential solution. And then I'm going to come back to the African angle towards the end. So I'm going to start with this. What is it about the health problems of old age that has been so daunting, that has prevented medicine from bringing health to the elderly when we've been so successful in eliminating the infectious diseases that used to kill so many people early in life? I mean, let's face it, really simple things were what worked. Just discovering that hygiene is a good idea was enough to save an incalculable number of lives starting in the 19th century. And, vaccines and antibiotics are pretty elementary medicines. So what's so much more difficult about aging? Well, in order to introduce the answer to that question, I'm going to start by defining aging. And this is the definition of aging that I'm going to use. It's just 3 words. Aging is the accumulation of self-inflicted damage in the body. Metabolism, which is the word that biologists use to denote the entire network of processes that keep us alive from one day to the next, it generates damage throughout life, even starting before we're born. And that damage eventually exceeds the amount that the body is set up to tolerate, so it causes us to get sick and eventually to die late in life. Now, that kind of might tell you a little bit about what the problem is. You might think, well, the problem is that the pathologies of old age are very many and varied. As you can see here, don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. The whole point, of course, is that there are so many things that go wrong, and they go wrong at more or less the same time, so they interact with each other, they exacerbate each other. And that is indeed part of the reason why aging is so difficult to bring under medical control. But it's only part of the reason. And in fact, it's not even the major part. In order to introduce the major part, I'm going to now address briefly a different question. The question I'm going to address is, in what ways can people be sick? In other words, I'm going to give you a taxonomy of disease, of sickness. And the popular answer, which, as you may imagine, I'm going to tell you is incorrect, is given on this slide. Most people would say, well, there are infectious diseases, that's column 1. Then there's genetic diseases that a few of us are unlucky enough to inherit, that's column 2. And then there are the chronic progressive diseases of old age, like Alzheimer's and almost all cancers and atherosclerosis and so on. And then most people would say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this 4th category called aging itself, which consists of these rather nebulous and poorly defined concepts like frailty, or sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle as we get older, and immunosenescence, the decline in function of the immune system. Most people think of those as completely different from diseases, so much so that the kind of implicit implication is that it's kind of off limits for medicine, and it's natural and universal, and don't even think about doing anything about it. That's a bit of a pity, because it rather, makes it difficult for those of us who do want to do something about it to get the support of people who might be able to make it happen. But it's completely wrong. The result of that popular view is, tragically, that we spend a huge amount of money worldwide trying to cure the so-called diseases of old age, like Alzheimer's. We attack these pathologies directly, just as if they were infections. And of course, it's not going to work. You can just look at this diagram for half a second and see why it's not going to work. The pathologies of old age are consequences of this thing I'm calling damage, and damage is continuing to accumulate throughout life. So obviously, anything that attacks the pathologies, which is what I'm calling geriatrics, is going to become progressively less effective as the patient gets older. It's just obvious. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out. For more than 100 years, there have been a few people noticing that geriatric medicine is just never going to work. And they've been saying to themselves, well, let's be a bit more preventative. Let's try and intervene at an earlier stage of events. And that makes sense, because if we come back to what I said about the definition of aging, right, it's the lifelong accumulation of damage, but the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of damage. Then if you can somehow slow down the rate at which the body generates that damage in the first place, then you have a chance. You might be able to do something about this by postponing the age at which the damage reaches the amount that causes us to get sick. However, it turns out that hasn't worked either. So, well, why not? Well, this is kind of the beginning of why not. If we try to think about our classification of sickness again, we can actually correct it very simply. There's only one problem with the version I gave you earlier, the popular view. It's not the content of any of those 4 columns. They're all perfectly fine. The problem is where most people put that big black line. Most people have this idea I mentioned a moment ago that aging is this kind of non-disease thing that is kind of off limits for medicine. But the right view is that the word disease should not be used for column 3. Diseases really are only the things that come from outside of the body, infections, and the things that are genetic. The chronic progressive diseases of old age, as they're called, are just parts of aging. They're just the parts of aging that we've chosen to give disease-like names to. That's all. And that rather helps us to see that, first of all, column 4 is not actually off limits from medicine at all, any more than column 3 is. It's just that it also shows us that both column 3 and column 4 need to be attacked by a different type of medicine, a different type of thinking than what we would do for column 1. So that's basically why this hasn't worked. If you try to clean up metabolism, to make it run more cleanly so that it takes longer to develop the pathologies of old age, then what you're doing is, first of all, you're not doing very much good to people who are already in middle age or older, because they've already accumulated most or all of the damage that's needed to cause people to get sick. So that's a bit of a problem. But it's worse than that. It turns out that if you thought that the pathologies of old age were complicated, you've seen nothing. This is metabolism. In fact, this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And, anyone here who writes software will immediately see that this is, the ultimate catastrophe of uncommented spaghetti code. There is no way in hell that we're ever going to be able to tweak this system to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without at the same time stopping it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. Not going to happen. And of course, I'm understating the problem here. The real problem is not that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. The real problem is that it's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, which is completely dwarfed. Any biologist will agree with this, that completely dwarfed by the astronomical amount that we don't know about how the body works. And that's even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, forget it. But luckily, that's not the end of the story. I wouldn't be standing here if it were. The thing is that there's a third option. And I'm going to argue that it's the common sense option. I'm going to call it the maintenance approach. You can call it the engineering approach or the damage repair approach. The idea here is, what I've done in my definition of aging at the bottom is I have divided the process that goes from being alive to being dead into 2 component processes. The left-hand one where metabolism generates damage throughout life, and the right-hand one where damage generates pathology late in life. Fine so far, but I've also shown you that breaking either of those 2 component processes is a non-starter. It's just not going to happen. So, where do we go? Well, luckily, we don't need to break either of the component processes. We can just separate them from each other. And we do that precisely by going in and periodically repairing the damage that the body is creating. That's all that this approach actually is. Simply going in it, not even particularly thoroughly, just fairly thoroughly, repairing the damage so that even though it's going to be generated at a certain rate that we can't change, nevertheless, it will not reach the level of abundance that causes the pathologies of old age. That's all we're talking about. And if you think about the definition of aging I just gave, we could use it for a car as well. It's just as true for a car that it accumulates damage, rust and so on, as an intrinsic consequence of its normal operation. And that's why most cars don't last more than 10 or 15 years. But here's a car that's more than 100 years old, and it's doing just as well as when it was first built. And the only reason it is because the owners of this car have done comprehensive, periodic, preventative maintenance on it. That's all it is. So that's why I say that it's common sense. It obviously works. The top line of this slide is just to emphasize this a bit more, that the analogy with simple man-made machines like cars is actually a really accurate one, even though it may sound oversimplistic at first hearing. Aging is not some kind of emergent phenomenon of biology like, consciousness, for example. Aging is simply the same thing at fundamentals in a living organism as it is in a simple man-made machine. And once we recognize that, it tells us immediately what the most feasible and the most practical approach is to bringing aging under medical control. Now, of course, so far, I haven't really talked any biology. I've just talked about aging in the abstract, really. And it's time for me to change that and to talk about real biology. Because at the bottom here, I have the thing I haven't told you yet. I have told you that by doing all of this, we are essentially sidestepping our ignorance of metabolism, because we're not proposing to slow down the rate at which metabolism generates damage. And we're also sidestepping our ignorance of pathology, because we are not proposing to allow the damage to reach a level that causes the pathology in the first place. But what we are not sidestepping is the complexity of damage. So it could be, in a bad scenario, that the damage was just as complicated as the metabolism and the pathology, and therefore we hadn't really got a practical approach after all. But it turns out that's not the case. It turns out that even though there are lots and lots of different types of damage, because the body is really complicated, nevertheless, it seems that every single one of those types of damage can be classified into just 7 major categories, which you're seeing on the left-hand side of this table. And, I've been challenging my colleagues to come up with an example of damage which doesn't fit into this classification for nearly 20 years now, and I seem to be getting away with it. So it's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty likely that there is genuinely no 8th category and 9th category, and this really is an exhaustive taxonomy. That's really handy, because the utility, the purpose of this classification is the right-hand side of this table. The fact that for each of these categories, even though there are many examples of damage within each category, for each category, there is a generic approach to actually doing this maintenance thing I'm talking about, doing this damage repair. So I'll just talk briefly about the first one, which is loss of cells. That is a very broad category, but it's a clearly well-defined biological phenomenon. It's simply the process whereby cells die and they are not automatically replaced by cell division. Of course, in most tissues, when cells die, they are replaced by cell division, but there are some exceptions. The brain is a fine example. Now, it turns out that one part of the brain in which cells die rather more rapidly than anywhere else, it's called the substantia nigra, and those cells, because they are not replaced, become less and less numerous as time goes on. All of us, by old age, will have lost about 1/4 of them. But some of us lose them a bit faster, and if you're unlucky, you may have lost 3/4 of them by old age, and that's the kind of person who gets Parkinson's disease. Now, you've all heard of the way in which we can implement the damage repair approach in the case of cell loss. It is simply stem cell therapy. That's all that stem cell therapy is. We prepare cells in the laboratory, we kind of pre-program them into a state where we can inject them into the body, and they will then divide and transform themselves into replacements for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. In this case, we create something called a dopaminergic neural precursor cell. We inject them into the brain, and they divide, and they become dopaminergic neurons, and the problems of Parkinson's, which essentially revolve around not having enough of this important chemical called dopamine, just go away. Now, the first time this was tried, 25 or more years ago, it was only occasionally successful, because back then we didn't have much of a clue about how to do the first step, the programming of the stem cells into the desired state. So most people just didn't get the right kind of stem cell. But now, we know a hell of a lot more about that, and sure enough, everyone's very optimistic. There are half a dozen clinical trials for stem cell therapy in Parkinson's disease that are either ongoing now or starting up, and it's looking like we're probably pretty close to curing Parkinson's. So I don't have time today to go through all these other things, but let me just say that the reason why Sense Research Foundation was set up is because all of the other types of damage are considerably more neglected and less well appreciated than the stem cell case. And the corresponding therapies in particular were not really being pursued very aggressively. So we set up a foundation, a biomedical research foundation, to attract funding, philanthropic funding to support this work. Some of these approaches to damage repair were ideas that I've put forward myself. Others, in fact most of them, were ideas that had been put forward by other people, but not in the field of the biology of aging. They had been studied in other areas of biology, such as even environmental decontamination. So it just took a lot of putting two and two together and bringing ideas together that had not previously been put together. And that actually tells you a lot about why this wasn't happening. The system of academic funding worldwide is woefully inadequate in a variety of ways, and the main one is that it is hugely biased, first of all, in favor of working on easy problems rather than important ones, and secondly, in favor of against working in cross-disciplinary problems. These things are very, very hard to get funded by peer review systems, and it was necessary to set up an independent organization to get it done. It worked out, though. This is a small selection of the papers that we've published over the past few years. A number of these papers are really seminal breakthroughs that have unlocked research logjams that existed for 10 or 20 years in some cases, so we're pretty proud of all of this. They are just the first step, though. I haven't got time to go through this slide, but I will say that it's important to understand that this is now a mainstream orthodox way of thinking. When I first came along 18 years ago or so and started saying, listen, comprehensive damage repair is the way to go, hardly anybody understood a word that I was saying, and a lot of people thought that I was being unscientific and so on. But over a number of years, I was able to get my colleagues to understand a little bit about the feasibility and practicality of all of this. And now we're in the rather splendid state where most scientific opinion is in favor of it. This is our scientific advisory board, which is a group of extremely talented world leaders in all of the areas that we are pursuing. And what's even better is people have started reinventing this idea and pretending it's original. So this paper came out 5 years ago, published by a bunch of European grandees in the field of gerontology. They split aging into 9 categories instead of 7, but that's not because they thought of things that we had overlooked. It was just that they subdivided it slightly differently, but they had their corresponding fixes. So again, it was a divide and conquer damage repair approach. And I'm delighted to say that in marked contrast to the situation when I first started talking about this paper is now not being ignored. This paper, in fact, has been cited more than 2,000 times by other papers already, and it's going to be far and away the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this decade. So that's extremely good news. But now I'm going to come back a little bit to the wider context of this work, and again to the African context, one thing that you will notice if you look me up online and you check my media exposure is that there is a huge amount of breathlessness from journalists with regard to the consequences that might occur if we actually succeed in all of this to the extent that we expect to, in terms especially of how long people are going to live. It could very well be that people will live an awfully long time if they are no longer getting sick just because of being born a long time ago. And I think that's a really good thing. But the fact is, it's not what we work on. We work on health. And I feel that it's always really important to emphasize that, because nobody wants to be sick. Nobody wants to become sick at some later age either. Nobody wants to get Alzheimer's at any age. Nobody wants anybody else to get Alzheimer's either. So there's no kind of moral ambiguity about this. Whereas if you just talk about longevity, it's astonishing the number of people who will come out and say, oh dear, I don't want to live all that time. Wouldn't it be boring? Or, death gives meaning to life. Or, stuff like that. I mean, honestly. I get a lot of this, and I can understand it psychologically that people are just so terrified of getting their hopes up, of becoming in any way emotionally invested in this research, that they prefer to pretend that it's actually not a good idea. But I want you to know that it's not what we work on. We work on health. So in that sense, there is a huge amount of similarity between the situations that are generally understood to be health problems, and which of course are so prevalent in Africa, and the situation of aging, which is, as I've argued earlier, is often not seen as anything to do with disease and is somehow off limits for medicine. But I want to actually talk about a rather more specific African context for this, which is that the advent and the distribution of therapies that actually work. Now, of course, in the Western world, HIV is pretty much under control. I mean, I'm not going to say it's completely under control, but it's pretty much there. We know what we're doing with antiretrovirals. It took an awfully long time, an absolutely shamefully long time, for antiretrovirals to become affordable in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, there's still a long way to go, a very long way to go for Africa to catch up with where the Western world is in terms of HIV. That's really bad news. But of course, we kind of know why that took so long. The fundamental reason it took so long is that the main decision makers and opinion formers and wealthy individuals and so on in the West, by and large, very few of them have HIV. Whereas every single one of them has aging, right? And that's actually quite important because soon it is going to be recognized in the West and throughout the world that aging is a medical problem, and in fact that it is the #1 medical problem. And there will be a very great acceleration in the amount of effort that is put into not only developing these diseases, these cures for aging, these damage repair therapies, but also into ensuring that everybody who is old enough to need these rejuvenation technologies can get them. And I believe that because everybody has aging, it is going to be not so hard to ensure that the poorer countries of the world also have universal access to these therapies. I believe that this is going to be enormously assisted by the fact that we will have a lead time, that there will be maybe 10 years from the point where the world wakes up to the realization that aging actually is a medical problem and that the solution to that medical problem is coming. 10 years between that point and the point where the medical solutions do actually arrive. Now, that's quite a long time for all the political and economic dilemmas and so on to work themselves through. So I believe that in that sense, there will be a great deal of dissimilarity between HIV and aging. I believe that we can look forward to a much more ethical and much more egalitarian distribution of these medicines than anything that the world has seen so far. Part of it is going to be like this. Rather than thinking that, oh dear, where will we put all the people? Or, won't dictators live forever? Last I heard, dictator was fairly high on the league table of risky jobs. Not a lot of dictators die of aging in the first place, and the ones that do tend to figure out their succession. So, but I mean, goodness me, how would we pay the pensions? I mean, you're going to hear about this kind of thing in other talks, and you have heard, of course. We all know that it's not just this technology that's coming. There are lots of really, really important transformative technologies that are coming even faster and that are going to really, eliminate the possibility of all these problems. So all we have to think about is health, health, health. It's all about actually making people stay healthy, however long ago they were born. Also, if you can't get these problems on the left out of your mind, just really decide whether they are actually as bad as the problem we have today, in which literally more than 100,000 people die worldwide every day from aging. That's the kind of thing we should be thinking about. I don't have time to go through this because I'm already over, but I just wanted to mention that the progress that we've made over the past 10 or so years, even though it's been far slower than it would have been if we'd had a bit more funding, it's been enough to get a number of our projects through to a point of proof of concept such that we were able to get investors interested. So half a dozen of our projects have now been taken through to become startup companies that have been able to attract very nice funding, and there's a couple of dozen at least other companies that are now out there that have sprung up in parallel with us and very closely aligned with this whole philosophy I've been telling you about today. So there's massive investment opportunities. If you want to know more about that, then of course you should contact me and go to our website, sense.org. This one, for example, works on macular degeneration, an idea which we worked on very laboriously for several years, and now it's probably only 1 year away from clinical trials. Another one working on amyloidosis, one working on organ transplantation, one working on senescent cells. This is our campaign for bringing the rest of our project, or at least most of them, to clinical trials within the next 3 or 4 years from now, so long as we have enough funding for this work within the foundation, which is really still the engine room of the industry that's emerging now. I wrote this book. You can buy it outside unless they've sold out, and you can certainly buy it on Amazon and so on if they have. This tells you in much greater detail about all of the biology behind this, the nature of the damage that we need to fix and how we're going to fix it. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.